Thank you, Michelle. And of course, thank you very much, Danielle, for again and again pulling us all together. I've come because these initiatives are vital to face the kind of scale of challenges we face around the world. And of course, we have reason to smile because when we organize, we can take on these challenges. I'll give you just two examples from India. I think it must have been 2002. I saw in the papers an ad that Suez would be getting the water contract for Delhi and would be privatizing the water supply. And the water would be coming from the Ganges, from my area up in the mountains in the Himalaya, from a dam called the Tehri Dam that's on the Ganges, which has displaced 100,000 people when it was built, but it is continuing to displace another 100,000 because it's in such a fragile area, the mountain slopes are slipping into the dam and villages are coming down. So I saw Tehri, I saw Suez, and I knew we had to build a movement to stop this privatization. So we traveled all the length of the Ganges, the women who'd been displaced by the dam, the people who worship the Ganges River as a sacred mother, the farmers whose water would be diverted to the city. And in the city, both the rich and the poor whose right to water is treated as a leak in the financial assessments of the World Bank and IMF. You know, if you're not paying for water, it's leaking. And of course, the rich who were being told now you'll have 24/7 water in a country where women are walking 10 miles for clean water. So of course, the women would walk 20 miles and the rich would have swimming pools and golf clubs. So we built the Citizens Alliance for Water Democracy and worked very hard, did a lot of homework. The unions were vital because they had the knowledge and the data and the information. The water prices would have gone up 10 times. But we could show that it was very, very easy to do a public-public partnership rather than hand over the supply to Suez. And this was being done under World Bank pressure, just like in Bolivia, where Bechtel came in with World Bank pressure. And when Paul Wolfowitz, who was president of the World Bank, visited India with a $40 billion loan for privatizing India's water, we organized protests. He invited us to come and speak to him, and I said, only one thing we have to say to you. I gave him the Ganges water and said, you might think this is a commodity. I want you to remember, for us, it's sacred water and it's our commons. And hands off our Mother Ganges. Within 2 months of that, the World Bank project was cancelled, the water privatization to Suez was stopped. But of course, it doesn't mean the water privateers will say, never again. They're going to keep trying, and we'll also keep trying. We stopped the privatization of Delhi's water supply. Jose was in a little village in South India called Plachimada, where, again, it was around 2002, a group of women who had kept walking further for clean water because Coca-Cola had set up a plant, was mining 2 million liters of water per day, depleting the groundwater, and what remained was highly polluted. And at a certain point, my Lama, who is no more with us, she left us last year, 60-year-old woman, she said, why should we walk further and further? This company must shut down. And she and 10 women set up a camp opposite the gate of this Coca-Cola company and basically said you have to close. A year after their protest, they had invited me to join them for 1 year of a protest. And I remember there were 100 villagers and 500 policemen. And that's when I started to find out who was the local party controlling the local government, who were the politicians who would be willing to lend their weight to this tiny group of women, and very, very rapidly, within a year, it built such a broad alliance that no political party in Kerala could afford to not be sitting with the women. And the reason Jose was able to join us was because we had the World Social Forum, and before the World Social Forum, Daniel was at the Water Warriors Conference in Delhi, basically talking about water as a common good. Well, in 2004, Coca-Cola's plant was shut down in Pachimada. The High Court ruled that water is a common good, it's a community resource. Coca-Cola cannot commercialize it. But even more importantly, the ruling said the state does not have the power to hand over the water that belongs to the communities and the commons for commercialization. Of course, Coca-Cola is challenging it, but I don't think they're going to win. And meantime, the government of Kerala has sued them for billions for the damages they've done to the water, to the agriculture, to the health of the people, and that is still an issue that's going on. Of course, there are other aspects of the water privatization that we will jointly have to fight, because these aspects, by their very nature, take on an international and global form. One of these aspects was mentioned by you, Michelle, about how in effect industrial agriculture is a privatization of water, because it uses 10 times more water to produce the same amount of food and pollutes the remaining water with the nitrates and the pesticides. And you just have to see Punjab, which is the land of the Green Revolution, and I did a book on Punjab in 1984. Today, there is such high levels of chemicals in the water that a train leaves Punjab called the cancer train, with half the people on the train being farmers who are suffering from cancer, and they have to go to a hospital in Rajasthan, which is a charitable hospital. It's the only place where they can afford treatment. Now, to use 10 times more water without any gain in food security, I think is a crime in a time where water problems are the single most important reason for children dying, and water scarcity is the single biggest work burden for women in the third world. We've done a study for our statutory women's commission called the National Commission of Women, in which we've actually calculated the hours women are spending in walking for water. Because every time water is stolen or water is polluted, the externality is women's burden. The same happened with industrial shrimp farming, where shrimp farms were set up along the coast, all over India, all over Indonesia, all over Ecuador, everywhere in the world. And the fresh water of the coastal areas became salt water. The pollutants from these shrimp farms were thrown into the sea, killing all the fish life. And again, women were walking 10 miles. And I find 10 miles is the time the toughest of women will say no more. The aquaculture farm should shut down, or the Coca-Cola plant should shut down, or whatever is polluting. Bhopal was a disaster where a chemical leak took place from a pesticide plant. That was 26 years ago. Those leaks of the chemicals from a pesticide plant are still in the groundwater. And the children are still dying and being born deformed 26 years later. So we are talking about an agriculture system that is absolutely at war with the land and the water, and of course the biodiversity and the farmers. And all of this requires another violence, which is the violence of, when you privatize water, you must re-engineer the planet. You must dam the rivers, reroute them, take them to places where people can pay for water, and away from places where people can't pay. So normally, water goes from the villages to the cities. It goes from communities to the industry. And we stopped another mega project called the River Linking Project in India, $200 billion of madness. By the time you calculate, all the water will be flowing to cities. No river would be flowing as a river. Now, all of this is getting aggravated by climate change, because ultimately climate change comes to us in the form of water extremes. Either too little water in terms of a drought, too much water in terms of a flood, or a cyclone and a hurricane, also a problem with salt water. And Daniel said it so clearly that all systems that support life are commons. The air is a commons. Pollution of the atmosphere is an enclosure of the air. The pollution itself is a privatization, but then the solutions being offered, like carbon trading, are another problem. I am on the drafting committee of our national plan for the environmental chapter, and of course all the marketeers are there trying to say the solution is trade in water and air pollution. And we've seen what this has done. The 5% reduction on the Kyoto became a 17% increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. Trade in pollution doesn't work. All it does is reward the polluters, make them find yet another way to make money, while taking away the stability of the climate, which then starts to melt our glaciers. We have more loss of water. Our rivers that are snow-fed are going to be seasonal rivers in a few decades from now. The Ganges Glacier is retreating at 23 meters per year. 23 meters per year. And an average retreat of most Himalayan glaciers is around that rate. So we can, not in 2035, that was a mistake of the IPCC, but definitely in the foreseeable future, have a very serious crisis for half of humanity that depends on the Himalayan snows and the snow melt for water supply. In addition to that, because climate extremes are increasing so much, we have another related privatization, and that is the privatization of our biodiversity through patenting, through biopiracy. There are now 1,600 patents in the hands of the biotech industry, concentrated in the hands of 4 companies, for all crops that can withstand climate change. Whether it is drought-resilient crops, or flood-tolerant crops, or salt-tolerant crops because of cyclones and hurricanes. Now, this has not been genetically engineered. These traits have been given by nature, evolved by farmers, and stolen by the companies. All they're doing is piracy. So we see piracy of water, we see piracy of the air, we see piracy of the biodiversity that could help us face climate change and increase food security, because now we have enough experience that shows that the more biodiversity we have in our agriculture, the more productive our agriculture is, and the more resilient our agriculture is. Biodiversity is a solution to both hunger and climate change. But GMOs are being offered as a solution to hunger and climate change. It's a false solution, doesn't work. And I think these interrelated enclosures of the commons need to be addressed together in order to also address defending water as a commons. Because climate change affects the flow of water. How you do your agriculture changes your water regimes. And whether you have your seeds in your hands or not will determine whether you can respond to a changing climate. Now, what do I see as the challenges before us? You mentioned the forum of 2012 in Marseille. 2012 will also be the year of 20 years after Rio. And if you see the literature that is coming out for the Rio Plus 20, it's in the name of the green economy, but below that green economy is commodify everything that has not been commodified yet. So we're going to see more aggression on commodification of water. We're going to see aggression on commodification of the ecosystems that supply water through trade in ecological services. We're definitely going to see a push for trade in pollution, but we're now also going to see a push for trade in ecological services. That's going to be sold in the name of a green economy. And that's why, especially for the green parties, I think there's a very important role to play to already start defining the green economy on the basis of the commons. I think there's another very important link that we need to make. And that is a link to new processes that are starting from the Indian countries at a time where we've seen the entire climate summit undermined by the Copenhagen Accord. We've seen treaty after treaty undermined. And Daniel talked about the new challenge of how do we define ourselves as human beings on this planet. Now, those who've created all the ecological crisis and all the economic crisis say the solution is the very thing that caused the problem. Though Einstein had told us, you cannot solve the problems using the mindset that created them. You've got to have a change in thinking, you've got to have a change in paradigm. And that's why the commodifiers will be even more aggressive in the next few years. They will use the economic crisis to privatize further. They will use the ecological crisis to privatize further. But what's exciting from Bolivia or Ecuador is, for example, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth that was announced by Evo Morales on Mother Earth Day of 2010. Ecuador has managed to put into its constitution the rights of nature. And I was invited a few weeks ago to lead a challenge on the basis of this constitutional recognition of the rights of nature, to challenge British Petroleum for its crime against nature in the Gulf of Mexico, against the water and the sea. And I think people are just waiting for this new consciousness. Another way of thinking that doesn't make them dependent on the Suezes and the Violas, that doesn't make them dependent and subservient to the conditionalities of the IMF and the World Bank, and it doesn't make them dependent on the market, which is just another word for concentration of economic power, and a perverse worldview that says that everything is a commodity. We've been part of the WTO fight where, what was it? No, our world is not for sale. And we have to say it all over again. We did it in Seattle, but I think in the next 2 or 3 years, the voice of the people will have to deal with a very tiny minority of people whose ideas have failed, whose worldview has failed, whose recipes have failed people in the North and in the South. They failed nature and they have failed society. And I think we need to have the courage to say another world is being born and we will be its midwives.